when the roadless rules came out and the Forest Service is now arguing in many of their EISs that logging and road building in roadless areas now, they don't harm roadless characteristics at all or wilderness characteristics. The constant through here is the Forest Service has always wanted to log and develop roadless areas. Since the policy ostensibly changed, their language changed with regard to whether or not it's development or protection.
Welcome, Wild Ones. This is Josh Schlossberg, host of the Green Root Podcast, the official podcast of Eco Integrity Alliance, where we're on a quest to uncover the roots of the ecological crisis. For this episode, our return guest is Gary Macfarlane. Gary has either worked or volunteered for various wilderness conservation organizations since the late 70s in Utah, Montana, and Idaho. Since retiring in 2022 from his job at Friends of the Clearwater, he has been a board member and has served on the boards of Wilderness Watch, past, and Alliance for the Wild Rockies, currently. Katie Bilodeau and Gary Macfarlane prepared a detailed report in 2019, revised in 2020, that was based on data from the Forest Service. It focused on key questions such as how well the 2001 Roadless Rule in Montana and the 2008 Idaho Roadless Rule in Idaho protected roadless areas. That is why Gary is here today, because we're going to talk about roadless rules. So welcome back to the Green Root Podcast, Gary.
Thanks so much, Josh.
Well, you are the best person to talk to about this. So let's just start from the beginning and tell our listeners and remind those of us who are somewhat familiar, but maybe not all the details, what is the Roadless Rule and what is currently potentially happening to it?
Okay, the Roadless Rule was an effort during the Clinton administration to try and protect roadless areas on the National Forest System. You may ask, well, why is that important? Well, there's a history here. The Wilderness Act, when it passed in 1964, required two federal agencies and later a third, the Bureau of Land Management, but two federal agencies to inventory every roadless area over 5,000 acres in size to determine whether or not they might have wilderness characteristics. Those two agencies were the Park Service and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Now, the Forest Service wasn't included in that part of the Wilderness Act because they had already had a system of primitive areas and administrative wildernesses that predated the Wilderness Act. But not long after passage of the act, it became clear that the Forest Service probably needed to do an inventory as well, because there was a lot of land that could be designated as wilderness on the National Forest System that was not included in the old primitive areas or became automatic wilderness in 1964 in the Wilderness Act. So that's sort of the background. It evolved, and in the 1970s, there were two roadless area review evaluations for the National Forest System. They called them Rare 1 and Rare 2. That revealed the extent of roadless areas on the National Forest System. It was to a large degree. It wasn't perfect. Neither of those two inventories were perfect. But that's where the fight started with the Forest Service. Once people realized how much land out there was really wild and provided benefits, watershed protection, wildlife protection, backcountry recreation, people became very concerned about protecting those areas. And some of the prime areas were slated for development. I'll use an example. In Oregon, there was a big fight and included direct action over a large roadless area that was part of the, what's now part of the Siskiyou National Monument down there in southwestern Oregon. And it was also part of the greater Kalmiopsis Wilderness Roadless area. So things got heated. There was direct action even here in Idaho on a sales called the Cove Mallard Timber Sales in the 90s, areas that should have been part of the Frank Church River of No Return wilderness. So because of the concern over protection of roadless areas and the Forest Service's desire to develop them all, the Clinton administration, through pressure from the public, decided to come up with a rule that protected the roadless areas. Part of the rationale for that rule was there were somewhere in the neighborhood of 400,000 miles of roads on the National Forest System, and the Forest Service really didn't have the budget to maintain all those roads. And when a road isn't maintained, it usually bleeds sediment into streams, which is very bad for fish. So the chief of the Forest Service at the time, Mike Dombeck, was a fish biologist, and he realized that more road building in roadless areas for logging purposes, and that's usually what developed roadless areas, although not always, it wasn't a good idea given the existing road system on the national forests. So that was one of the reasons, or perhaps one could say excuses, that he used to develop the Roadless Rule. The conservation community, in large part, got behind the Roadless Rule. But when it came out in 2001, it was weaker than many of us had hoped for. And in some ways, it was weaker than even some of the bigger conservation organizations, the big greens, had believed it would be. And that sort of is where we are today. The Roadless Rule did protect some areas, but at the same time, it was litigated during the Bush administration by kind of the timber industry and others who did not want to see protection of roadless areas. And all those lawsuits eventually lost. But what happened is, in the interim, the Bush administration allowed state governors to petition the Forest Service, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, to come up with their own state rules. And that's how Idaho in 2008 got its own state rule that is much weaker than the Roadless Rule of 2001. So between 2001 and 2008, Idaho was variously under the same Roadless Rule as the rest of the country. And obviously, you can probably talk about Colorado in more detail, because Colorado is the other state that has a separate Roadless Rule.
Great. Well, that is a great history backstory of the Roadless Rule. There are pieces there that I actually wasn't aware of. So let me just ask a couple clarifying questions, and then we'll get into what they're trying to do to the Roadless Rule. So are you saying that the Roadless Rule was set up not just to permanently keep them, or even temporarily keep them, under that current level of protection, albeit weak, but was sort of like a reserve for future potential wilderness areas?
Yes. In fact, that was the reason the roadless areas were inventoried in the first place, is to determine whether or not they were suitable for a wilderness designation. And those two inventories I talked about, Rare 1 and Rare 2, in the 1970s did that. To the disappointment of the conservation community, those two inventories, especially Rare 1, was very flawed. It didn't include all the roadless areas, and neither did Rare 2, but it was a much better inventory. But the recommendations for wilderness were very low, somewhere in the neighborhood of less than a quarter of the acreage, probably much less than a quarter of the acreage, maybe a fifth or even less than that, if memory serves. I don't have those numbers right at my fingertips right now. But so that was one of the big disappointments to the conservation community, was the recommendations. What happened, though, with the National Forest Management Act and the various rules that were established in that act, the Forest Service looks at the wilderness question and looks at what one would call roadless areas every time they revise a forest plan. Now, because of the roadless rule, the Forest Service doesn't use the same terminology it did in the past. It just calls these areas with wilderness characteristics, even though they are technically roadless areas, or should be. So that's uh, kind of a strange policy sort of wormhole we need not go into um, right now. But this bifurcation has led to a lot of confusion among members of the public of, well, is this area roadless or isn't it? The roadless rule is pretty much a static rule protecting certain areas that are already mapped. There's very little, if any, ability to change that map.
Sure. And so I do want to get into what the current roadless rule does and doesn't protect, but let's just cover what the Department of Agriculture under the Trump administration is attempting to or in the process of doing for the roadless rule right now.
So what it is doing is repealing the roadless rule. Now, they haven't done that yet. They have to go through a process um, that even they recognize if they weren't to do that, they would be sued and probably lose in court. So they have to go through a process. When the roadless rule was established, an environmental impact statement was prepared. So they'll probably have to do the very same, do an environmental impact statement. And what they're trying to do is repeal the roadless rule. However, they've verbally said in news reports that their intent is not to repeal the Idaho or Colorado roadless rules, which I think in both cases are considerably weaker than the national roadless rule. But the acreage figure that has been bantied about in the newspapers includes all roadless areas, including that of Idaho and Colorado on the National Forest System. So there's a little bit of doubt there, but I think it's just due to the fact is the Department of Agriculture under this administration can't add numbers. But other than that, I think it's pretty safe to say that Idaho and Colorado won't be included in the repeal.
Okay, that's helpful. So what is the acreage that we're talking about?
Well, if you exclude Idaho, which has about 9 million acres, and Colorado, I don't know what the acreage is down there. My guess is somewhere in the neighborhood of 4 million on the National Forest System. You might know better. So it would be somewhere in the neighborhood of 40, I don't know, 42, 43 million acres of roadless areas that are in the inventory. And I'll put a little tiny caveat on that. There was an exception in the 2001 roadless rule that said areas that were previously developed, again, the inventory they used was an older inventory, even though it was within the roadless area, needn't be kept in its roadless state because it wasn't roadless anymore. So even though it's mapped as such, now I don't think that much acreage really falls into that category, but there might be some acreage. So I would guess somewhere in the neighborhood of 42, 43 million acres.
Okay, good to know. So yeah, the numbers for Colorado roadless rule, it's 4.2 million acres. It says, now, can you just explain, because I'm still a little bit confused about the state roadless area versus federal. So the state designation is still a federal designation, has nothing to do with the state of Colorado government, right?
That is right. The Bush administration allowed states to petition the federal government so the federal government could come up with a separate rule for any state that wanted to do that. And I believe the only states that petitioned the government to do that were Idaho and Colorado.
Okay. Thanks for that. Yeah, I was still trying to wrap my head around that. This is a topic I'm not as well versed in the details, and this is why you're here. So thanks for all this. I'm sure our listeners are very, very happy to get all these details in one place. So, okay, so the goal right now is a lot of environmental groups. It seems pretty much the vast majority, nearly all of them, are saying, yo, we can't rescind the roadless rule because it's really important. And we all agree with that. So the issue is, of course, if they protect or they don't manage to roll back the roadless rule, that will be a huge victory because all those forests are permanently protected from logging and any other development, right?
That would be a victory, but how permanent the protection is from logging and development, I think is a matter of perspective. And this is where I wanted to explain what Katie Bilodeau and I did well, it's actually more than that now. It's been about 5 years ago, 6 years ago. We looked at, and we could only look at Idaho, and we looked at Montana. Those are the two states in the lower 48 that have the most roadless acreage in the national forest system. Idaho's the largest, and then Montana was second largest. Montana has 6 million acres. So we took a look at the development that had taken place according to the Forest Service, because in Idaho and Montana, they kept a chart on an Excel spreadsheet of what development had actually taken place in roadless areas, in part because the Idaho Roadless Rule set up a roadless commission. That this commission of people, citizens that were appointed to it, and agency officials, they were updated on what was happening in roadless areas. And since northern Idaho is in Region 1, which also includes Montana, of the Forest Service, they just did it for both states. Well, we went and looked at this spreadsheet. We found there was a lot more logging and in fact, even road building than had been predicted in these roadless areas in both Idaho and Montana in the various EISs, the one for the 2001 Roadless Rule for Montana, and, which included Montana. I think it was broken out, as I recall, by state. There was a little chart or table in that EIS that suggested what they thought might happen in terms of roadless development. And the same is true for Idaho. And since we did that report, Idaho's numbers have radically increased, even though it was greater than what the EIS said would be developed, considerably greater. We're seeing a huge increase, mainly in forests in the southern part of the state, which are in Region 4, but also some on the Panhandle National Forest in northern Idaho and the very northern end. So it's been an eye-opener, and I don't think anyone else has gone and looked at the results of the actual implementation of roadless rules and the exceptions. Now, what we found was the exceptions generally weren't used soon after the roadless rule came into place. They weren't, I don't think, used at all in Idaho, and they certainly weren't used on the Nez Perce and Clearwater National Forests. And those were the areas of focus, the two national forests of focus for Friends of the Clearwater, because that's basically the Clearwater Basin. So when we looked at the environmental impact statements and environmental assessments that developed roadless areas, we were shocked to see that much more had been proposed. And in fact, in Montana, the Forest Service claimed this road was not a road. And the Alliance for the Wild Rockies filed one lawsuit, and I believe a group called Helena Hunters and Anglers filed another against the Forest Service. And they had taken pictures. I think Montana Hunters and Anglers or Helena Hunters and Anglers had taken a picture of this road that was going into this roadless area that the Forest Service said had just been built, bulldozed, said it wasn't a road. And the judge really slapped the Forest Service in the face. But it's hard to know how many times the Forest Service did things like that and tried to call something that was in fact a road built for logging purposes not a road. So that happened. So we found that much more, as I said, was developed than what the environmental impact statements had projected.
Yeah. Well, thank you for all of that. Unfortunately, also a lot of logging has been occurring in Colorado and Colorado roadless areas because if they have the exception of wildfire, they can pretty much go in there and do what they want. This has been happening recently. And now, right now in Colorado, it's actually the biggest logging project of the century. It actually might be the biggest one in Colorado history, a national forest. It's 116,000 acres of logging over about 200,000 acres. And it includes, let me find the details, 18,500 acres within, supposedly protected Colorado roadless areas. It's called the lower north-south
Wow.
vegetation management. So we're dealing with that right now. It's actually been a 100% media blackout for over a year. We've had about 60 people we've taken out there on hikes, written endless press releases, all sorts of information. They just, people won't talk about it. So we're hoping, sadly, now is actually an opportunity to call more attention to this based on a little more knowledge and PR around just roadless rule in general. But another disturbing component of just roadless rule in general, if you look in the details of the original rule, it does allow for, quote, timber harvesting, development of valid claims of locatable minerals, grazing of livestock, and off highway vehicle use, and other loopholes. Specifically, this is a quote, timber to be cut, sold, or removed where roadless characteristics have been substantially altered in a portion of an inventoried roadless area due to the construction of a classified road and subsequent timber harvest, whatever that means. And then there's another exception for broad forest health treatment. So that's resulted in scientifically debunked destructive clear cut, quote, salvage logging in sensitive post fire habitat. That was something that I worked on when I first started doing work on public lands, was in Oregon in the, quote, biscuit timber sale in Oregon. And they were pushing through logging in roadless areas, which my recollection is they were able to do the logging. They just did helicopter logging. So no roads, no harm done. Hey,
Yeah, that's very interesting and very disturbing, in fact. And you're right, that's a huge sale going into um, a group of roadless areas. Is it one roadless area? Is it more than one that's happening there
no,
in Colorado?
it's multiple roadless areas. Yeah, it's about yeah, so it enters into 87,000 acres. Logging is going to occur in 18,000 acres. So it allows clear cuts up to 40 acres. This is in Denver's drinking water supply. So yeah, these are some really sensitive areas. The Forest Service claimed about one of these roadless areas called Rampart East is the largest and least human impacted area remaining in the Rampart Range, forms a critical core area for wildlife at the edge of the rapidly growing Interstate 25 urban corridor. And then the Bear Creek portion is a, quote, near pristine example of a Colorado Front Range transition zone between montane and plains ecosystem. So this is one, two, three, four, five,
Wow.
six, seven. It's seven different roadless areas.
Yeah, now that's tremendous, a tremendous amount of logging in
Yeah.
one project. And I think we've seen some of those like that in southern Idaho. I haven't seen anything that big up here in northern Idaho, except perhaps on the Panhandle. But that's massive, and that's because I suspect the Colorado rule is weaker than the national rule, and the same is true for Idaho. So that's disappointing. And you're right. The exception you mentioned about areas that have already been developed is why I came up with the estimate of maybe 42, 43 million acres, because the inventory at the time when that 58.5 million acres were made was a little bit off. If you do the math, 58.5 minus 13, somewhere around 45 million acres, but there might be some already developed areas inside that, and they're allowing them to be logged even more, those areas within kind of however the Forest Service decides to draw the area of development. And they may draw it very broadly and actually include stuff that has not been developed. So therefore, you're going to see more roadless logging under that exception in just the 2001 roadless rule. And as I said, what we found in Montana at the time is they had um, tens of thousands of acres, of logging, somewhere in the neighborhood of 30 to 40,000, as I recall from our report. The numbers weren't always reconcilable from the Forest Service data. The FEIS may say one thing and their little chart might say another thing, but they were very close. They just weren't always the same figures. And a lot of that may have been because when they actually sold a timber sale, they adjust the acreage boundaries a little bit. So that may account for some of the discrepancies that we found in our report. But yes, the roadless rule, even the 2001 roadless rule, is allowing logging on the ground.
Yeah. And so many of our concerns is not just the state roadless rule is insufficient in protection. The federal status quo is not. And I would argue that they have been about to ramp up logging in these areas, whether or not this roadless rule got rescinded, because again, it does allow for logging based on quote forest health. So that can mean pretty much anything. And what we've seen on the federal level, this actually started under the Biden administration, was this emergency declaration, which added up to about 1 million acres that were at least proposed. Some was approved, and that would allow expedited logging and skipping through some of the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA stuff around litigation. So that was 1 million acres that we were tracking across the West. Then the Trump administration, after the declaration of the executive order to increase timber production, so then the Secretary of Agriculture declared this emergency action logging across 112 million acres. Now, obviously, they're not going to get around to doing all of that, but I assume that under that 112 million acres, that's 59% of national forest. That probably does encompass some roadless areas. So my question for you, Gary, is while it's certainly something we should be doing to prevent as best we can the rollback of the roadless rule, is this not also a good opportunity for us to be demanding more, or at least pointing out a lot of the weaknesses and the loopholes in the existing roadless rule?
I think it is. I think it's a chance to say what we were originally calling for back in the 90s, when the late 90s, when the idea of the roadless rule was just beginning under the second Clinton administration. We were asking that there will not be motorized use, for example, in the roadless areas, and there not be logging in these roadless areas. But that obviously didn't happen. And as I mentioned earlier, I think the rule was even weaker than some of the large conservation organizations were thinking it would be better than what it actually came out to be. So yes, we should be calling for a stronger roadless rule during this process. That doesn't hurt anything at all. And
Right.
as an aside, I would suggest we shouldn't be trying to codify the roadless rule, especially the one in Idaho. And Colorado may have a similar problem, because the one in Idaho prohibits the Forest Service, unless they amend the rule, which is a very difficult process, from adding additional protections to roadless areas in Idaho. So the vast majority of the roadless areas in Idaho are under what they call backcountry restoration. And restoration means logging to the Forest Service. So
Sure.
it would not allow us, it would prevent us, in fact, from seeking stronger protections in the forest plan. Now, that doesn't mean these areas might not remain undeveloped just because they may not be the ones that the timber industry wants right away. But a lot of great areas could be developed because of that. And if it's codified, then I even question whether or not the citizens would have a right to go to the Department of Agriculture and actually change the roadless rule, because it's codified in legislation, and that might be a question for the courts. So I don't think it's a good idea for a weak rule like Idaho's that have problems like the prohibition on stronger protection, which the 2001 roadless rule does not have, for that to be legislated. Yet that seems to be a proposal coming out of a lot of conservation organizations. They want to support the Roadless Area Conservation Act, which codifies not just the 2001 rule, which has weaknesses we've mentioned, but it codifies a really bad Idaho Roadless Rule and a Colorado Roadless Rule, which many of those same conservationists actually fought against the Idaho Roadless Rule and tried to take it to court. So it seems like the goalposts have changed. People are saying, well, let's not go for this. Let's just go for the status quo. And the status quo keeps getting worse, as it did in 2008 for Idaho. So that doesn't seem like a very good strategy to me, is to call for just maintaining the status quo, which has problems.
Right. And so, yeah, I think we could probably wind this down with talking about the difference in philosophies amongst different conservation advocates, or however you want to frame it. So some of us right now are putting together a sign-on letter, and I don't want to name the names of the group because it's not finalized, and who knows if everyone will still be a part of it. But it's based on some rewrite of the language for roadless area that would remove those loopholes. So we think certainly it's something worth putting out there. And what, so some of us were recently on a call with lots of national environmental groups around roadless. It was about 110 groups were there. And of course, most of them were saying, well, we have to fight to keep the roadless rule, which again makes sense to a certain degree. And then a few of us chimed in, myself, including Gary and some other folks, or at least one other person who was willing to speak publicly, or at least in the chat there, saying, well, this is a great opportunity for us to be more proactive, to have something, in my opinion, which is more of a long game, inspiring public lands campaign where people can really unite around it and can excite members of the public. Because what we're seeing from this strategy of let's just keep stepping back, defending the status quo, we are getting our heads handed to us. And it's not just the Trump administration. The Trump administration, per usual, has got the pedal to the metal. But like I said, that emergency action stuff that started under the Biden administration. So what happens is a lot of the not great stuff starts under the Democrat. This is my personal opinion, starts under Democrats. A lot of the big green groups don't want to speak out against that. And then it just gets worsened and exploited under Republican administrations. I will also say some of our biggest cheerleaders in Congress right now for what I call wildfire pretense logging are Democrats, just up there with Republicans. Here in Colorado, pretty much it's all of the Democrats who are pushing really hard for that. Senator Hickenlooper, Senator Bennett, Representative Neguse, they are the biggest champions of logging in the name of wildfire. So anyway, what I'm getting at is that I think it's a philosophical difference. They say, oh man, we got to keep stepping back. We're saying, understand that perspective, but that's been the dominant way that most larger conservation groups, not grassroots groups, not what you and I and others have been doing, Gary, but it's just been kind of stepping back. And guess what? They tried that and it's been losing. So is it not time to try another strategy and be able to leverage the fact that finally people are aware of these issues to get stronger protections? What do you think? Even if it doesn't happen right now under Trump, what's your take on all that?
Well, I think it certainly is. I'm old enough to remember a time when there was some bipartisanship around public land conservation, wilderness conservation issues back in the 70s. And one of the strongest supporters of the Wilderness Act was a very conservative Republican. He wanted the act to even be stronger, a guy named John Saylor from Pennsylvania. So, yes, I think the hyper-partisanship exhibited by some of the larger conservation organizations doesn't always serve us well. I think that's a problem. So I agree with you 100%. And I would remind people too that the first iteration of the so-called Healthy Forest Act under the Bush administration, I call it the Horizontal Forest Act, but Horizontal Forest Restoration Act, it was promoted by Senator Dianne Feinstein, who was a Democrat from California. So I think people need to remember it's been happening for quite some time, that there's the only bipartisanship has been on the destruction of the national forest system to make a little joke and maybe overstate a little bit, but that seems to be the bipartisanship.
No, you're right. And for a long time, many have said, why can't they just get along more in Congress? And we're like, no, 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 not like that.
Not like that, exactly. That's the
Don't get
problem.
along don't get along on the bad stuff. So yeah, unfortunately, and we've talked about it many times on the podcast, it's been a denial of science. It's been attack of science and ecological advocates. And because you can just say yell wildfire in a crowded room and it freaks everyone out, that's been a very successful tactic of theirs. And pretty much all logging these days is under some guise of wildfire or forest health or pretend restoration or whatever. But I guess, yeah, to close this here. So obviously, I'm not going to name names. And again, I do respect a lot of the work that the what people will call big greens are doing. I think there's a lot of overlap there with the grassroots, but I do think that they have a philosophy and strategy that has been proven to not be successful. And it might be time to try another thing. And what harm would it be, at the very least, in the grassroots coming together to try another thing? But what I was told is that that's undermining what they're trying to do. And what my response was, and I'd be curious what you say, and you sort of already did answer this, but just in terms of the idea that saying this would undermine the efforts to prevent the rollback of roadless rule, saying, hey, we should not let the roadless rule get rolled back, and we should improve the protections because they're not strong enough as current. Do you really feel like that undermines the effort? Can't they still do their thing and then we push harder? And what's the problem?
Well, I don't see a problem. In fact, having somebody flanking you on that side, being probably more visionary, let's say, than the status quo is actually a good thing politically. And usually that's what political scientists argue helps causes, is having somebody else out there asking for a little bit more. So I don't see it that way. And Josh, I'd like to make one other point. I would encourage people to go on the Friends of the Clearwater website, look under our reports, and look at this roadless report. Yes, it is dense because it is a complicated topic. It's about 40 pages or more, and it goes into a lot of detail. But I think it's important to look at it for a couple reasons. One is it documents how the Forest Service language has changed a little bit. And two, it documents how some things have not changed with the Forest Service. Prior to sometime in the 90s, let's say, or early 2000s, the Forest Service always maintained that logging and road building was an irretrievable commitment of resources. In other words, it pretty much eliminated an area for a long period of time from being considered for wilderness. When the roadless rules came out, and the Forest Service is now arguing in many of their EISs that logging and road building in roadless areas now, they don't harm roadless characteristics at all, or wilderness characteristics. The constant through here is the Forest Service has always wanted to log and develop roadless areas. Since the policy ostensibly changed, their language changed with regard to whether or not it's development or protection. So I think that's an interesting thing to be aware of.
Absolutely. And we will certainly link to that roadless report that you put together. And yeah, Gary, thank you so much for, well, certainly all of your work that you've been doing on these issues for decades and your strong stances on this, and for coming on the Green Root podcast to explain the situation to our listeners. And frankly, like I said before, to me, I have a general understanding of this stuff, but I was not aware of a lot of these details. So this will help me be a better advocate on these particular topics. So yeah, thank you so much, Gary. And if people want to get a hold of you, or find out more about what your organizations have been doing besides that roadless report, is there something you'd suggest to them?
I would suggest they just go to the Friends of the Clearwater webpage. Like I say, I'm on the board. I'm an older guy now, so I did retire from work at Friends of the Clearwater. I'm in my late 60s now, but friendsoftheclearwater.org, or could email. The emails are there, and the phone number for the office is there, 208-882-9755. So yeah, and that's a way to get hold of me as well for people if they want to find out more about that. I'm not there all the time, but I don't live far from the office, and the folks in the office can give me a call, and we can talk about some of these issues, because I think they are important, and the history is important to understand that roadless areas are potential wilderness. And as our culture tries to dominate nature even more and more, it's kind of the corporate takeover of everything we're witnessing now. We need to be aware that roadless areas certainly have value, and that our uses of them, even recreation, because it's becoming spelled with the WRECK now, unfortunately. We need to be mindful of what we do and our actions on wild country and the planet as a whole.
Well, thanks again for everything, Gary.
It's good talking with you, Josh. Thank you.